So welcome to the exida webinar on predicting valve reliability. Today we're going to take a look at some different topics that affect where the data comes for valve reliability studies, talk about functional failure modes, look at some field study results, talk about the effects of application stresses, and then finally review a proposed hybrid approach that tries to get the advantages or take advantage of the strengths of each of the different techniques. So, for getting failure rate information, there's a couple typical areas, and they include looking at industrial databases, looking at publications by industry groups or within larger companies that might have their own guidance. There's field studies or return studies done by valve manufacturers or equipment manufacturers. There's a technique used for calculating mean time to fail or useful life of a product, which is sometimes referred to as a V10 analysis. There's end-user specific studies where end users look at their populations of equipment and their experienced failures. And then finally, there's the modeling technique, FMEA, which uses a database of component failures to model and predict the reliability for an assembly. So we're going to take a look a little bit at each of these different sources. So industry databases are a good source of information. They're useful because they're published. Usually the analysis technique is well documented. The sample size or the population size is well documented. And one of the main ones used in the process industries for reliability data is exida. And that's operated by DNV in Norway. The analysis is done by SINTEF. SINTEF publishes a handbook or a data book of the failure rates, failure modes, and their method for calculating them. It's updated every few years, so the database continues to grow and the population grows, so that's all good stuff. One thing it does do, though, is it includes what would be considered any real or realistic failure. So it doesn't, by design, it doesn't try to distinguish between a random failure of a component, a wear out of a component, misuse of a component. If it's a valid, if it failed, they want to capture that and put that in the data. So sometimes the failure rate can be higher than would be expected in, say, a safety system. Another source of data are company or group committees. Usually those committees are made up of experienced experts, and those experts get together and share their, essentially experience of different failures that they've witnessed or seen. Now what's included in that analysis or what's included in the database can vary widely because the experience of the different groups can vary. But it's very valuable in that it gathers and documents the expertise of the people and the experiences. So it's very useful in that perspective. So the absolute failure rate may not be perfect, but the different scenarios often are very informative. One such committee is a Nomura Committee 130, and they publish failure rates for sensors or for devices to be used in safety systems. And they publish essentially, here for failure rates, they're publishing 1,000 dangerous failures for the sensor. For pressure, they're saying it's 400 for the valve. So it's a starting point, but it's not necessarily exhaustive, or it's not easy to scale or to apply to different types of technologies because it's one number covering all valves or one number covering all of a certain type of transmitter. Another source of data are manufacturer field studies. So OEMs do a good job of obviously tracking what they ship and tracking what they return. So it's a benefit that it's based on a real set of data. The drawback is that they don't know everything about that equipment once it leaves. So they know what they ship, they know what they get back, but they don't know how many were installed, how often they were tested. So this data tends to underreport failures just because not all the information gets back to the OEM. An additional caveat is that many manufacturers classify return items as failed only if they can trace it back to a defect, and they might not be recording, or they might be attributing things to plant and operations that really are random failures. But it is a very useful source of data because it's one of the more readily available. There's many different companies shipping and monitoring products, so it is it can be quite helpful. B10 data is not suitable for all uses of failure rate data. So B10 basically is back calculated from life tests of components, mechanical or electromechanical. So based on an analysis of the failures per really usually cycles, then it extrapolates back a failure rate. Now that failure rate can be useful if the device is in a continuous demand or a high demand application where it's being used and cycled and where wear out would be the predominant failure rate, but it's not as useful for an analysis or an application such as a process industry safety system where a predominant failure rate could be something such as binding. And studies show that even if a device sits dormant for more than 24 hours, the forces required to move it increase dramatically, and therefore the modal distribution between wear out and, say, bindings shifts pretty dramatically. End user field studies are very good. Big plus is that it's a study of an actual population. A negative can be that different groups even within the same company can define failures differently. The way they categorize it can be a challenge. And from looking at more than, or performing dozens of these and looking at studies done by other companies, some of the key things we've identified are to understand when is a failure report written, what triggers a failure in the plant. So if somebody just goes out and changes out an instrument and doesn't record it, that may never get into the database. So there has to be some controls on that. How does a company define a failure? Did the technician record the as found conditions? What were the operational conditions? And one thing that is happening though is that new data collection software is improving the failure rate and the reporting of that information. So a thorough end user study where all those pieces of information we just talked about on the page before have been documented is extremely useful, and there are some out there, and they're tend to get published, and you can use those as good baseline data points when you're comparing them to other studies. So to get failure rate information, one of the challenges, if we want to use this information in real time to design systems, is collecting enough information to be able to be used on a new product or unique product before it's obsolete. So if there's a new technology or a new thing you want to use, how do you get that data? So there's a technique called FMEA. This is a failure modes effective diagnostic. analysis. And essentially, when not enough statistics at the product level have been gathered, you can build up a model of that product using an FMEA approach. So it's really a predictive model that looks at the design strength to predict the failure of a product. So the process is there's a component database that lists down to the level, say, of a resistor or an IC or a spring or an O-ring, the component type, and that will have the failure modes and the failure rates of those components. And you basically go part by part, every part in the device, build it up and talk about if there's this failure occurs on this component, what impact will that have on the function of the device? And by doing that, you can get product failure rates, product failure modes, and diagnostic coverage. The output is going to give you detailed results that will give you failures between whether they're safe or dangerous, how do they fail from a functional perspective, do they fail high, do they fail low, are they no effect, and then basically by having these numbers, having safe and detected, you're able to get diagnostic coverage, and you're able to create a pretty robust model of the device. The biggest negative of the FMEA approach is that it is essentially reliant upon the robustness or data accuracy of the component database. So that's bad component database into it is going to give you a bad FMEA result. What we've done at Exida for our component database is that we correlated, first we publish a component database. We have an electronic component database and a mechanical component database. And we kind of validated or verified that database by doing field data studies. So every time we do an assessment of a product, we'll do an FMEA analysis, but we'll also ask the manufacturer for shipment and return data and use that as a correlation. So we've evaluated over 150 billion hours of field failure data to correlate this database. So essentially, we start with a detailed design of the product, perform the FMEA using the component database. The FMEA will give us product level failure rates and failure modes. We compare that with the specific field study of the device we're certifying. If there's good correlation, it validates it. If there's not, then we dig in further to understand where the discrepancies are and either revise the FMEA or identify the systematic fault in the product, or sometimes a combination of both. So we've got a pretty good component database. If we look over here on the right-hand side, that's the component database. It will be down to things like a resistor or a spring, as I said. And is it okay? Is it an open? Is it a short? Is it a drift? At the left-hand side is at the far extreme will the function work or not? And where we really want to evolve to is where we can understand and predict functional failure modes. So if we worked back from the left, let's say we have a field study, and sometimes there's really good details about what failed, and sometimes there's not. But when there's not good details, it just said, level control failed. Well, you don't know if it's the sensor, if it's the controller, if it's the valve. So it's either okay or failed, you know that. Then a tier 2 analysis would kind of go down and say, functionally, what didn't work? Oh, it was reading high, it was reading low, it was stuck. So that would kind of, from a functional failure approach, tell you what function in that system didn't work. And then that could be traced back at that point, going backwards. If you took a specific failure and went backwards, you would trace that down to, oh, the transmitter current was stuck high, or let's say it was a fail low. Transmitter current failed in such a way that it drove it low, or we lost the fill fluid in the capillary and we weren't reading anything, so it failed low. Then that can be traced back to a specific component and the effect of that failed component. So we really want to start trying to bridge to be able to create this whole data map from a component level to an operational field level. And that is improving as people are implementing the proof testing required by the safety standards. They have to do more data collection. They have to do periodic proof tests. They have to record the results. So that is providing more information. So that information comes in the form of field reliability studies. Now, field reliability studies get reported very differently because people treat things differently. So there could be random failures. So there's random failures and systematic failures. Random failure is a failure occurring at a random time which results from one or more degradation methods. And then a systematic failure is essentially only one that could be eliminated by modifying the design, a manufacturing process, or a procedure. So systematic failures are going to be in the entire population, and random, as it says, will be randomly occurring. But how people categorize failures can be quite different. Here's a slide from a presentation where one certifying body was saying that all mechanical failures are predominantly systematic in nature. And that's just not accurate. There's many random failures in valves and field systems. We did a little study at Exida where we put some different scenarios out there and had people eventually did a web survey about how they would categorize it. And the key thing here isn't so much the answer to any one study, it's just to see how people do categorize different things. So in this case, a PLC output failed de-energize, which de-energized a trip valve and brought the process offline. So in that scenario, most people thought it was random failure, but quite a few people still thought it was a systematic failure. In another case, a technician who checks and adjusts trip points made an error. He set the trip point too low on a power system, and when power was lost, the generator didn't come online, and most people said that was systematic, although still a pretty good proportion said it was random. Now, in this case, the procedure was correct, so there wasn't a mistake in the procedure. The operator just made a mistake. And then in our final example, after 4 years, the solenoid coil burned out. So is that an end-of-life failure, a random failure, or a systematic failure? And again, most people thought random, but there was still a pretty good chunk that said end-of-life. And now on all these slides, we actually realized we misspelled systematic, but, well, is that systematic or random? So the definition of failure modes is very important and often really drives it. You've got to define that stuff up front. Another consideration is application stresses. So devices, the same device could be in many different, experience many different stresses or many different applications, and it's going to behave differently. That leads to a discussion of whether failures are attributed to the product or to the site. So back at More Products, the study was done where it looked at the failure rates of DCS components, and it kind of was surprising to see a 4x difference in failure rates between different sites. Well, digging into it, the service department and engineering department found that the worst site, the site with the highest failure rates, had some pretty significant systematic issues in how they were handling and configuring things. So when those were corrected, it cut that site's failure rate down from 4x to 2x, the best case. So systematic failures can result in really dramatic swings in experienced failure rates. So it leads to the question about how do we categorize random and systematic failures between product and plants. So I think we all would agree that manufacturing defects, unexpected stresses, random equipment failures are going to be random product failures. Design flaws, documentation error, manufacturer problems are going to be systematic. Also systematic would be the incorrect procedures or incorrect calibration procedures or selection procedures or test procedures at the site, so that's systematic. And then what about failures on the site such as maintenance errors or test and calibration errors or unexpected stress events? So depending on who's looking at the data, they very likely could categorize this differently. So a manufacturer might say, hey, all those site-related things are customer misuse. And if they ignore that, then they might be underestimating the total failure. It's probably best to try to include not only random product failures, but the capability or the probability of a maintenance error. And we would call that maintenance capability in the random analysis. And then the truly systematic stuff, well, that can't be addressed by quantitative analysis. That has to be addressed by the process side. So we would propose a hybrid approach to trying to take the best of all these different techniques and come up with a way of having realistic failure rates that can be modeled effectively but then improved as data is available. So the proposed hybrid approach is use the FMEA technique to send a base failure rate for typical failures, publish minimum and maximum modes, minimum and maximum rates, publish the data according to functional failure modes, develop factors for application stresses and site capability, and then refine that over time as actual plant data is available and analyzed. So from the FMEAs, at this point there's quite a few done for each product category. We can take a look at those FMEAs, use them to set a lower and upper bounds, and correlate them with field data studies, the ones that are available now and others as they become available in the future. So essentially, we do a predictive analytic analysis, and here's an example of it done with pressure transmitters. So the two green dots are actual field studies. The blue diamonds are FMEA results, and if we plot that out, we see that within these two green bands would be our expected range of failure rates. The two blue bands are really kind of the outer extremes. You can see even within that, there's almost a 2x in failure rates, which can be associated or usually attributed to specific design considerations or design details. But with that, we could set a yellow flag, hey, we're outside the expected range. We're still within the min or max of the product family, but we're outside typical, so there's something going on there. And if you're outside the outer limits, then you really have to pause and say, okay, we're not tracking at all. So it's a way to take the analysis that are done and present it in a way to give indication of what percentage of a population that's been analyzed falls in there. Using that, we could, once we establish that, we could come back and do field studies with published methods to do that and compare the results of the field study to the predictive analytics. Is it falling within the bounds we'd expect? If it is, that's great. That kind of validates the collection method. And collection method, as we were talking about, if failures aren't clearly defined before the data is collected, you don't know how they're going to be recorded. If we can go back to that functional failure mode flowchart and say, have we defined the data we need to collect and the criteria of how we're going to determine what the mode is and record it, so we can have multiple people collecting data over a period of time. So if we compare the field study to the results and it meets the model, then that kind of validates the study, even if the sample or the size of the study is smaller than ideal. If not, it's an indication to go back and take a look at the collection method and collection criteria used in that study to see if there's something wrong there. So it's a way that we're going to be able to take smaller sets of data, validate them, and then start extracting and learning more quickly. So the proposal or key takeaway is, first, the source and method used to generate data is necessary to make informed decisions about how or where that data is applicable. Second, the intended application of the data should have an impact on the method and rigor used that's applied to get it. And I kind of use an example that if you're using a piece of data from marketing literature, that's important, but you might, if you exaggerate a claim there, well, you're overselling your product. If you underestimate the failure rate and you put it into a safety reliability calculation, you're designing an unsafe protective function. Thirdly, increased adherence to the standards such as 61511 is making more data available. As people are doing proof testing, recording it, and storing it, it's making more sets of data available with a little more rigor in the collection. So, and the ability to fit those smaller sets of data against a large data set will increase the analysis and speed. They increase analysis speed. So basically, that all those FMEDAs and those small sample of large field studies that exist kind of give us a baseline, and now we can take smaller sets of data, compare it against that, and validate to say reasonable or not. So we're going to get more sets of data that are going to be more application specific, and then so finally we're going to begin to pull out we should be able to begin to pull out some application influences, industry influences on the data, and begin to get those scaling factors to understand how specific applications may result in lower or higher experienced failure rates. So that's that's kind of the nutshell of the slides. So I'd like to open it up for questions at this point. Okay, so one question was about how to the source of the data and the comparison of that to specific applications. So it's true that the component database at this point is general. It's really an averaging or a amalgamation of failure rates from many different industries, because the field's failure studies that we've done, an OEM doesn't necessarily, or not doesn't, an OEM doesn't have his field return data broken down by industry. So at this point, those field studies, the field return studies, have been across essentially all industries, all process industries using safety systems. So it's heavily chemical, refining, petrochemical, those types of applications, but it's not segmented between them. So the base data that's going into it would be averaged over all those industries. So the goal would be in the future, as we get more sets of proof test data from specific industries, that if we as the industry can see a variation between industries or type of plant, we'll be able to have a scaling factor for those applications. But at this point, it's more generalized. Okay, I don't think at this point there's no other questions. So we will be, I guess, thank everybody for attending, and we will be hosting the webinar on our website and sending a copy and a link to everybody. So again, if anybody's got a question, they can ask it. We'll do another minute on. If not, we'll sign off. Okay, well, thank you for joining, and everybody have a good day, good day, and a safe day. Thank you.